Hey, it's Medium Jenny Lee. You might have noticed I have a haircut. Nice. I have a new backdrop. It's gorgeous. Um, so, if you've been keeping up with these videos as they come out, there has been one every day that comes out at 8 o'clock a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And as of right now, it is almost 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the video has not come out for the day. And unfortunately, this is going to become the norm. And because if you didn't know already, I'm a teacher and we go back to school. We go back to work on Monday. So these videos will be a little more spread out. They might be a little sporadic. There's definitely not going to be one a day. Because as you well know, if you've been watching them, each one takes between 40 minutes and an hour just to record them, much less uploading it, etc. So finding an hour during the week to do anything is almost impossible, unfortunately. So bear with me as they come along for the rest for the rest of this book, probably. It is what it is, my friends. Let's get started on today's session. It's going to be session 22, which means this is video number 23. Carla asks some questions. What? Yay, Carla. All right. The instrument would like to know why she smells incense at various times during the day in various places. She spent a lifetime of dedication to service. At this time, she has conscious and unconscious distortion towards service, and conscious distortion towards service by communication. Each time that we perform this working, our social memory complex vibrational distortion meshes more firmly with the instrument's unconscious distortions towards service. Thus, we are becoming a part of the instrument's vibratory complex and it a part of ours. This occurs upon the conscious level, the level whereby the mind has gone through the roots of consciousness, which you may call cosmic. So, the consciousness of Ra and the consciousness of Carla, because they've done this work so many times now, 22 times, they're starting to blend with each other and like kind of leave a little bit of each other, in there. So interesting. The instrument is not consciously aware of this slow changing of the meshing vibratory complex. However, as the dedication on both levels continues, the working continues, there are signals sent from the unconscious in a symbolic manner. Because this instrument is extremely keen in the sense of smell, this association takes place unconsciously, and the thought form of this odor is witnessed by the entity. So what does this mean, people? Does this mean that other spirit signs are also thought forms created by our own unconscious melding with others? So, spirit signs. Spirit signs, previous to this information, seemed like it was, and I didn't understand how it worked, and I still don't understand how it works, but I know that spirit signs are a true thing, and I've experienced many of them myself. And what I thought was happening was spirit or specific spirits, sometimes specifically like your loved ones, on the other side will give you a sign. One of the most common signs of spirit sign is seeing a bird for a specific loved one. A lot of times it's a cardinal. The cardinal symbolizes a passed on loved one, and when somebody sees a cardinal, a lot of times when people see a cardinal, it makes them think of that loved one, and therefore they feel like it's a sign from that specific loved one that they're present, that the spirit is present. But there's a ton of different spirit signs, tons of them. And everybody's can be different. They don't have to be something so generalized as the cardinal. Some can be very specific to an individual person, like a penny showing up out of nowhere, a smelling somebody's perfume or cigars, or it's like anything that reminds you of the person that has passed showing up out of nowhere, and it doesn't make sense that it's there. It happens with insects too, dragonflies, butterflies. There's really a never-ending list of stuff. And I'm sure some people have very specific things for themselves. And what it seemed like was that it was purely the spirit somehow controlling the environment to make us be aware of their presence. That's what I thought anyway. But here Ra is saying that we are in this specific instance of Carla and Ra, Carla and Ra have been melding together through all these sessions. And unconsciously, she is starting to take on some of the vibrations of Ra, and Ra's also taking on some of the vibrations of Carla, because they're melding together. That's how they're getting this information. So what I'm wondering is if, because our loved ones on the other side are really with us all the time, they're with us a lot, if they're not melding with us, and we don't, most people aren't aware of it, and that's what's causing these things. Because Ra is saying that Carla is making a thought form of the smell of incense as a symbolic sign that has to do with Ra, but only because they'd been melding together. So does that mean that, like, for example, let's say, you and Grandma have been melding together unconsciously, you're not conscious of it, and because you guys have been melding together, you already have this strong connection anyway because it's your grandma, then when a penny shows up out of nowhere, that actually that penny is a thought form that your unconscious has made so that it knows. It's something physical so that you consciously know that Grandma has been around, but really your unconscious has made it, but it couldn't have made it unless Grandma had been around. It gets real complicated, but it was 822. That's my number. So I think I'm onto something here. Think about it for a while, guys, and tell me what you think. I never have ever thought about that, nor would I have ever thought about it that way. Let's keep going. Okay, next she would like to know why she feels more healthy after she does the sessions. Generally more healthy as time goes on. This is a function of the free will of the entity. This entity has for many years prayed a certain set of sound vibration complexes before opening the communication. Before the trance state was achieved, the prayer remained within the conscious portion of the mind complex, and though helpful, was not as effective as the consequence of this prayer, which then goes directly into the unconscious level, thus more critically affecting the communication of the spirit complex. So Carla's always been saying a specific prayer, but it was only sitting in the conscious level. So it was helpful, but not as helpful as it was when she somehow moved it to the unconscious level by doing this work with Ra, is what I'm taking it. Also, this entity has begun, due to this working, to accept certain limitations which it has placed upon itself in order to set the stage for services such as it now performs. This also is an aid to realigning the distortions of the physical complex with regard to pain. So she's like realigning herself because she's been able to accept her own limitations. Acceptance. Moving along, Dawn asks about the average lifespan at the end of the major cycle. By the end of the second major cycle, the lifespan as you know it, with certain variations among geographically isolated peoples, more in harmony with intelligent energy and less bellicose. So there's variations geographically. But what's the average? The average is misleading. To be precise, many spent approximately 35 to 40 years in one incarnation, with the possibility not considered abnormal of a lifespan approaching 100 years. So, overall, average, if you had to take an average, 35 to 40 years at the end of the second major life cycle, which was 25,000 years ago. But it wasn't unusual for some people to live to be 100. Can I assume that this drastic drop from 700 years to less than 100 during the second 25,000 year period was because of an infestation or a condition of lack of service to others? Partly correct. By the end of the second cycle, the law of responsibility, good Lord, there's so many laws. The law of one, the law of attraction, the law of responsibility, the law of confusion, which is also the law of free will. There's like, how many laws are there? Okay. Has begun to be effectuated by the increasing ability of energies to grasp their lessons, which there are to be learned in this density. Thus, entities have discovered many ways to indicate a bellicose nature, which is, remember, like a fighting nature, not only as tribes or nations, but in personal relationships. So people were just, in general, aggressive and probably, I want to use the word contradictory and argumentative with each other. And at that point, it wasn't just between groups of people, it was between individual people. So that's one of the problems. And then the concept of barter giving way to the concept of money. So instead of bartering or trading items, we came up with money. That's the second problem. Also, the concept of ownership having one ascendancy over the concept of non-ownership on an individual or group basis. So I'm taking that as slavery because it's talking about owning a person or a group of people. So those are the issues. Not getting along with each other, having money instead of trading, and people owning people. Each entity then was offered many more subtle ways of demonstrating either service toward others or service to self with the distortion of the manipulation of others. Each lesson was understood. Those lessons of sharing, giving, and receiving and free gratitude, each lesson could be rejected in practice. So because of free will, there's more subtle ways to show that you're either serving others or serving self by sharing, giving, and feeling gratitude. But people have the free will to reject all of those things too. Without demonstrating the fruits of such learned teaching, the lifespan became greatly reduced, for the ways of honor duty was not being accepted. The ways of honor and duty were not being accepted. So like, instead of being able to trade with someone and I have something, you have something, then people could start collecting money. You see what's going on here. It led to less lessons, less less lessons to learn from, in more subtle ways. So, yeah, it lessened our lifespan by a whole lot. Would this shortened lifespan help the entity in any way? By having more times between incarnations to review their mistakes? Or does it just hinder? Both. The shortening of the lifespan is a distortion of the law of one, which suggests an entity not receive more experience in more intensity than it can bear. You know, there's a phrase like, God only gives us what we can handle. That's pretty much what Ra just said. By having a shorter lifespan, then each entity should not receive more experience in a more intensity than they can bear. I feel like some people who've lived through some real terrible stuff would maybe not agree with that. This is only in effect upon an individual level and does not hold sway over planetary or social complexes. So that's just individually. Thus, the shortened lifespan is due to the necessity of removing an entity from the intensity of experience which ensues when wisdom and love are, having been rejected, reflected back into the consciousness of the Creator without being accepted as part of the self. It causes the entity to have the need for healing and much evaluation and incarnation. You can see I put a little sad face next to this. So, bear with me a second. I've got things on my screen. I'm trying to flip it, and there's so many things in the way. Oh, no. Okay. All right. Hold on. I got it. This part is really sad. So it's like an individual person has to experience, when they experience such intense, awful things, that they've rejected love and wisdom. And because of that, it's being reflected back into the consciousness of everything else. And they're not accepting it as a part of themselves. So they're not accepting all of the bad crap that happened to them in their life as being part of themselves. They're saying, it's something that happened to me, but it's not part of me. Then they have to experience this healing and evaluation of their incarnation. It's really awful that so many people would get to that point where their life was so awful that they reject love and wisdom. And then the other sad part of that is that it gets reflected back into the consciousness of the Creator, back into the consciousnesses of everybody. The incorrectness lies in the truth that given appropriate circumstances, a much longer incarnation in your space-time continuum is very helpful for continuing this intensive work until conclusions have been reached through the catalytic process. So it just seems like having a longer life, you'd have more time to figure it out while you're incarnated instead of having to figure it out when you're not, which seems like it would be more beneficial. So here comes the elder race again. You spoke of the South American group that was harvestable at the end of the second cycle. How long was their lifespan? So remember, at the end of the second cycle, the majority of people are living between 35 and 40, some people up to 100. But the small group of people in South America were still living up to 900 years. Then I'm assuming the planetary action that we're experiencing now, which shortens, it seems, all lifespans, was not strong enough at that time to affect and shorten their lifespan? Correct. It is well to remember that this nexus of space and time, there's great isolation as possible. So people could live in little pockets and never ever see other people. How many people were populated the Earth at any one time. So Ra's saying, basically, I assume you mean at the end of the second major cycle. So at the end of the second major cycle, 25,000 years ago, there was only approximately 345,000 people on the whole planet of Earth. Can you imagine? So 25,000 years ago, there's only 345,000 people. 345,000. And now we are up to, like, I don't even know, 8 billion. The last time I heard it was 8 billion. But that's been a while, so has it gone up? That's insane. That's insane. How many were harvestable out of the total number? 150. There's only 150 entities at the end of the second cycle that were harvestable to the fourth density. Yeah, and they were the ones from the South American group that lived to be about 900 years old. Only 150. So this is the elder race. A group of South American people, the end of the last 25,000 year cycle, 150 of them were ready to move up to the fourth density out of the whole planet of people. Don said that's a very small number. Then the next cycle started. Are these the entities that stayed to work on the planet? These entities were visited by the Confederation and became desirous, which means they have the desire of remaining in order to aid the planetary consciousness. This is correct. They all decided to stay. What type of visit did the Confederation make to this group of 150 entities? A light being appeared, bearing what you may be called a shield of light. It spoke of the oneness of infinity of all creation and of all those things which await those ready for harvest. It described the golden words, the beauty of love. It described in golden words the beauties of love as lived. It then allowed a telepathic linkage to progressively show how those who were interested in the plight of the third density It then allowed a telepathic linkage to progressively show those who were interested the plight of third density when seen as a planetary complex, and then it left. So this light being showed up to the deceased people that were waiting around in our interplanetary planes of this group of South American peoples, and showed them what the fourth density would be like, that is full of beauty and love and light. Also showed them what would happen, also showed them all the terrible things that were going to happen in the third density on the planet Earth. And then it leaves. Oh, man. Did all the entities then decide to stay and help during the next 25,000 year cycle? Yes. As a group, they stayed. There were those peripherally associated with this culture that did not stay. However, they were not able to be harvested either. So, beginning at the very highest, shall we say, of the sub-octaves of the third density, repeated this density. Many of those who have been of a loving nature are not wanderers, but those of this particular origin of second cycle. So there's a lot of notes here, a lot of notes and a lot of things to discuss. And, all right, so if you've seen previous sessions, I don't know what numbers it was, at some point when the wanderers were introduced, which the wanderers are fourth density beings, social complex beings that come to Earth to incarnate, to help, I started to question what I was, because I did not feel like I was just your everyday average third density being. And then after that, the elder race was introduced. And then that felt completely right to me, because I didn't feel like I was from a different planet. I didn't feel like I was this conglomeration of different beings. Like, I still feel very individual. I'm very connected to the earth. I know that this is my home, whether I've had other incarnations from different places or not. And now we're talking about them again. And when I read this paragraph, and I got to the sentence that says, many of those who have been of a loving nature are not wanderers, but of this particular origin of second cycle, I had to stop reading, and I had a very physical reaction. It was like a vibrational tingling all over my whole entire body, which I get a lot of vibrational tingling quite often, but usually it's like the top of my head, like forehead and back. That's usually where it stays. This was my whole entire body was having a vibrational tingling sensation that was much more intense and a little bit more frantic than my usual kind of gentle head tingling. And then I felt a sense of sadness, and then I just started crying. I was crying and crying and crying. So for me, that was more validation that that's what I am. There was one little bit in this last paragraph that we probably should go back over a little bit. So there were those that were peripherally associated with this culture that did not stay, but they weren't harvestable either. So there was some people that were kind of like related to these people on the outside of, around them, that they were like with them, but they didn't want to come back, but they weren't ready to be harvested into the fourth density. Even though the small group of 150 people were ready to be moved on to the fourth density, all of them came back. The ones who wanted to come back and the ones who didn't want to come back all came back to the highest sub-octave of the third density. So remember, there's like 7 sub-octaves within each octave. So there's 7 different layers, levels within the third density. So they all came back at the highest of the 7th. The highest of the third. The 7th of the third. It's a lot of weird numbers. Let's continue. Are all of these entities still with us in the cycle? The entities repeated the third density major cycle have, in some few cases, been able to leave. So some of them have left over this last 25,000 years. These entities have chosen to join their brothers and sisters, as you would call these entities. So they're like staying together, but they're not reincarnating. Were any of these entities names that we know from the historical past that have appeared as incarnated beings we find in our history? Yes. St. Augustine, St. Teresa, St. Francis of Assisi, these entities being of monastic background, found incarnation in the same types of ambience appropriate for further learning. Let's go over who all these people are, in case you don't know. Which I knew St. Francis of Assisi and I'd heard of the other ones, but you know, I'm not Catholic, so I don't know. Okay, Saint Teresa of Avila. She was a Spanish noblewoman called to the convent life. She was born in 1550 and she died in 1582. She is the patron saint of missions, florists, sick people, and people ridiculed for their piety, and a bunch of other stuff. You know, saints are like patron of places and other things too. So we have a nun from the 1500s, Saint Teresa. Saint Augustine of Hippo was born in 354 and he died in 430 in Algeria, which of course then was like part of the Roman Empire. He was a bishop and a philosopher, and he influenced Western philosophy and Western Christianity. He's the patron saint of brewers, printers, theologians, theologians, and some other stuff. So we've got a bishop from the 1400s. And then St. Francis of Assisi, who's probably my favorite because he's the patron saint of animals. He was an Italian friar. Nobody's really sure when he was born. It was around 1181. He died in 1262. Patron saint of animals, merchants, and ecology. So we've got a nun, a bishop, and a friar from Spain, Italy, and the Roman Empire. From all different times. Well, then, as the cycle terminated 25,000 years ago, what was the reaction of the Confederation to the lack of harvest? We were concerned. Yes. Was any action taken immediately, or did you wait for a call? The Council of Saturn acted only in allowing the entry into the third density of other mind bodies, sphere complexes of third density, not wanderers, but those who sought further third density experience. This was done randomly so that free will would not be violated, for there was not yet a call. So they're saying that after the last 25,000 year cycle, they randomly started letting third density beings reincarnate so they could keep going. But there wasn't a call yet. So before we get into the calling, which is going to go back to Atlantis, I did a little research because there's an issue here. Science, history, and archaeology have not discovered a lot of stuff. As by stuff, I mean artifacts, proof of existence, or skeletal remains of. They just haven't found a whole lot of stuff in the Americas that's really, really old. But they keep finding more stuff. They keep finding more stuff that goes back further and further. And I think one of the issues is that there were so few people back then that they're probably just a few little groups of people here and there spread out all over the place. And because there's so few of them, that would mean there's less stuff that would be viable or not completely destroyed or disintegrated and lost to time to find. But I looked it up, and I'll tell you in a minute. So, as of right now, this stuff's constantly changing. As of right now, the oldest skeleton found in South America is 11,000 years old. She was found in Brazil, and she's called the Luzia woman. 11,000 years old. Oldest skeleton parts. They found enough of her body. It's not the whole body. Okay, Now, there's a dirt pyramid with human burials in Peru that's 15,000 years old. Funny that it's in a pyramid shape. And here, this was just discovered in 2021. See, things are continuously being found. Fossilized footprints were found in New Mexico that are 23,000 years old. So that was a big jump. The oldest, habitation area was 15,000 years old in Peru. The oldest skeleton is from Brazil, 11,000 years old. But just last year, they found fossilized human footprints that is 23,000 years old in New Mexico. So we're getting there, people. That's only 2,000 years off from when these South American peoples were supposedly moved up and, going to be moved up in the cycle. So yeah, weird stuff. Okay, so the next call, remember, Confederation gets a call of people that need help. It's from Atlantis. Was the first call then at a time before Atlantis became technologically advanced? Basically correct. They did the technological advancement of Atlantis. Then did the technological advancement of Atlantis come because of the call? Not at first. At about the same time as we appeared in the skies over Egypt and continuing thereafter, other entities of the Confederations appeared to the Atlanteans, who had reached a level of philosophical understanding, shall we misuse this word, which was consonant with communication to encourage and inspire studies in the mystery of unity. So they were philosophically starting to understand some stuff. However, requests being made for healing and other understandings, information was passed having to do with crystals in the building of pyramids as well as temples, which were associated with training. So they sent information about crystals, pyramids, temples, and training. Was the training the same type of initiatory training as the Egyptians? Training was different, and the social complex was more sophisticated and less contradictory and barbarous in its ways of thinking. So the Atlanteans at that specific time were a little more sophisticated and a little less contradictory and barbarous. Therefore, the temples were temples of learning rather than an attempt to being made to totally separate and put upon the pedestals the healers. So the Atlanteans were using the temples as a place to learn. The Egyptians were putting the healers on a pedestal. So were there priests training in these temples? They weren't priests because they didn't practice celibacy, obedience, and poverty. They weren't priests in the sense of celibacy, obedience, and poverty. They were priests in the sense of devoted to learning. The difficulties became apparent as those trained in this learning began to attempt to use the crystals for things other than healing, because they got involved with the governmental structure. People in power wanted to use them for things other than healing. Does that sound familiar? Was all their information given to them through an instrument like Carla? There were visitations from time to time, but none of importance in the historical passage of events. So none of the visitations were recorded down in history, so they're not considered important, probably to us in the third density, because we wouldn't have known about them. What conditions were necessary for these visitations to occur? 2 conditions: the calling of a group of people whose square overcame the integrated resistance of those unwilling to learn. So remember, the square is like for every 10 people, it basically means that there's like, it gets multiplied. So like for every 10 people, it's really like 100 and some people calling. So there was more people calling than not calling. The second requirement, the relative naivety of the members of the Confederation who felt that direct transfer of information would necessarily be helpful for Atlanteans as it had been for the Confederation entity. So what you're saying is these naive Confederation entities had the same thing happen to them in the past, so they did the same thing for the Atlanteans? Correct. So one of the Confederation entities had had help from someone from the Confederation when they were in the third density, and it turned out fine. So they thought it would be okay to contact the Atlanteans directly. We remind you that we are one of the naive members of the Confederation and are still attempting to recoup the damage of which we feel responsible. So they also consider themselves to be naive because of how they contacted the Egyptians, and they're still trying to fix it. It is our duty as well as honor to continue with your peoples, therefore, until all traces of the distortions of our teach learning have been embraced by their opposite distortions and balance achieved. So they got to keep on keeping on until the shit gets fixed. Then I will state the picture I now have of Atlantis, and you can tell me if it's correct. We have a condition where a large number of entities of Atlantis have started at least going in the direction of the Law of One, and living the Law of One for their call to be heard by the Confederation. This call was heard by the Law of Squares. It overrode the opposition of the Atlantean entities not calling. The Confederation then used channels such as we use now for communication, and also made contact directly. So contact through telepathy and contact directly. But this turned out to be a mistake because it was perverted by some of the entities of Atlantis. Is this correct? So remember, Dawn was saying all that. Ra says, this is correct except for one thing. There's only one law. That is the Law of One. Other so-called laws are distortions of the law, some of them primal and most important for progress to be understood. However, it is well that each so-called law, which we also call way, be understood as a distortion rather than a law. There is no multiplicity to the Law of One. That was real confusing. There's only one law, everything else is a distortion. Okay, so then Dawn says, could you give me the average lifespan of the Atlantis population? The average lifespan is misleading. The Atlanteans in the early part of their existence lived to be about 70 to 140 years. So the beginning of the Atlantean time, 70 to 140 years was the average lifespan. But due to increasing desire for power, it decreased rapidly and in the later stages of the civilization. Thus, the healing and rejuvenation information was requested. So they were doing okay. They screwed it up with wanting to have power. Their lifespan started to decrease, and that's why they started calling out into the universe for healing and rejuvenation. All right, last bit of session 22. Is there any way that we can make the instrument more comfortable? They usually ask this at the end of each session. The instrument as well, it is somewhat less easy to maintain clear contact during a time when some or one of the entities in the circle of working is not fully conscious. Somebody done fell asleep, and this is what they said at the bottom. Footnote, there was a visitor present for this session who lay down on the floor to meditate and subsequently fell asleep. Who was the visitor? Come on, guys. Ra said, don't bring any people in here. I wonder if it was Leonard. Because Ra said, Tom and Leonard can come hang out. That Puharich guy's not okay. And really, you shouldn't be adding anybody else because it's really just you guys that are working together the best. So Ross said, don't you be falling asleep. All right, let's review what we learned in this session. All right, Carla got to ask questions, and we learned some more information about possibly how spirit signs work. That was really interesting. Tell me what you think about that. And then we learned some more about why the lifespan changed so drastically from 700-year lifespan to, like, you know, barely anything. We learned about some of the issues with having a short lifespan. We learned more about the elder race. Then we learned some more about Atlantis. And that was pretty much it for this session. So, if you enjoyed the session, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget there's a lot more sessions before this one, if this is one of the first ones you're coming across. And there's going to be a lot more after. And once again, I apologize for them not being able to come out every day very soon. But we will be guided to learn the information as we learn it. Divine timing. Things happen as they're supposed to happen. So thank you for sticking with me this long. If you have been watching all of them or a lot of them, I very much appreciate it. And I am looking forward to continuing this work because I really feel like it's super important. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.